Thank you for listening to The Luminous Mind, Episode 52, Part 2.
I think really, if something's going to save us, it's the idea that we can have a flexible mindset towards education.
Benjamin Franklin once said, "Do not curse the darkness, rather light a candle instead." If you're ready to set your mind on fire, then prepare yourself for the Luminous Mind with your host, Rebecca Bowman.
Today's fire starter is Fraser Speirs. Fraser is a well-known public speaker at events such as the Apple EU Leadership Summit, Albany Christian University Connected Summit, and Macworld Mobile. He regularly works with schools around the world focusing on next-generation educational technology, teaching practice, and curriculum. As we continue our conversation from yesterday, so with this introduction into technology in the classroom, what successes have you seen?
Well, the way I think about this, Rebecca, is that I look at what happens when students come to our school from other schools. And the problem I have quite often with this kind of question is that people want to know about test scores. And they want to know, did you put 10% on your exam scores or whatever? And honestly, I can't tell you that we did, partly because with such a small sample size, the variations from year to year are as much random or caused by other factors as they are by the iPad. Some years we might only have 2, 3, 4, 5 pupils going through certain exams. So it's very hard for us to statistically work that out. But what I look at, and the thing I really care about, is higher order skills. So think evaluation, synthesis, creativity, analysis, things like that. I'll give you one anecdote that I think kind of illustrates what I often see happening when students come to our school is that a student will come, they've been at another school, perfectly good local school, a perfectly able pupil, and they're just not operating at the same level in terms of the way they're thinking about a problem as students who've been at our school for longer. And I'll give you an example of that. I was teaching a day last year about how the internet works. And we were talking about routing information and how countries can be cut off the internet or censored or whatever. And at the end of the lesson, I said, look, here's 2 questions to get you started. Which countries censor the internet? And why do iPhones sold in Saudi Arabia not have FaceTime? And I set the kids off in those questions. And I said, use any app on your iPad to explain to me how you know the answers to those questions. A student who'd been with us for a while, she went onto an app called Explain Everything. She did an instructional video where she took a censorship map of the world, put it on the video, and then highlighted it and talked about countries like Iran and China and Syria and Saudi Arabia and different places like that. And she explained a few different reasons why people think Saudi Arabian phones don't have FaceTime. And in that class that day was a new pupil who had come to our school from another school. I went over to him halfway through the lesson. I said, how are you getting on with this little task? And he said, I can't find anything. I said, what do you mean you can't find anything? And he said, well, I've typed it in and I can't find anything. And I looked at his iPad and he had typed in, why do iPhones sold in Saudi Arabia not have FaceTime? He literally transcribed the exact question I'd said into Google. And he looked at the first 3 results because I could see those links had been visited. And all of those results told him the answer. But he just couldn't engage with what I was looking for them to do with this knowledge. He was looking at it like a treasure hunt. He was saying, well, I suspect this is probably how he had been used to using computers in his old school, was going on the internet and looking things up. And as long as you find it, you win. But what I was asking him to do was to read and understand and then synthesize a new piece of material that described his learning from those other parts. And he just could not mentally engage with the fact that he had been asked to do that kind of work. Whereas the other people in the class who had been there for a few years, she went straight ahead and just did exactly what I was thinking about. And it's not that this pupil was any less able than the Cedars pupil or that he had been at a bad school. He'd just not been at a school where they were immersed in technology in the same way. And it's that kind of higher order transferable skills that I'm always looking for in my classes. I'm trying to, when I build a project, it's not just about learning to use Keynote. It's not just about learning to use a spreadsheet. It's not just about learning to use, Google Docs or even Google itself, but it's about all of that in service of some bigger goal that involves skills that will survive and transfer beyond this current time in technology where, it's not going to be the iPad forever. I'm not saying the iPad will be the only computer we ever use, but I want to teach skills that work beyond that.
And maybe it sounds like you're inspiring creativity with the technology, not just an information gathering situation, but the creativity side of it.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I think when the iPad first came out, a lot of people derided it as a device just for content consumption. And what we have shown, and I have gigabytes and terabytes of data that students have created on the iPad to show that creativity is absolutely possible. In fact, it's the fundamental activity on the iPad. And I think people who see it as a content consumption device they're just making a fundamental error in their attribution there. So very, very much so we see it as a device for creativity and content consumption. I mean, one of the things that I find strange about that kind of line of criticism in education is that nobody criticizes books for being about content consumption. How do you create on a book? Well, you don't. Of course you don't. And if you create on your book, you get into trouble from the teacher because that's an expensive book. But consuming content is a fundamental part of education. We call it reading. And I'm not down on it just because of that. But what I find, like from our colleagues in the English department, I've offered them many times, said, what about electronic books? Because everybody asks me this question, so eventually I go and ask them that question. And they say, well, we don't want electronic books because if you put the book on the iPad, then we have to do our work on the paper. Whereas if you put the book on the paper, we can then have the iPad free to do work on. And the iPad's too valuable a work device, a creativity device, a device for expressing learning, to just lock it up as the textbook. Does that make sense?
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I've never heard that argument before. That's pretty, pretty
nobody in our school wants electronic books at all because the iPad's too valuable as a device to create on.
That you can write or do other things on. But you can do both, right? I mean, you click the double button and...
you can do that. I think it's harder. It's more cognitively demanding. Older students can do that much better than younger students can. I find quite often young students, if they've got two different files they need to work between, they want to print one out so they can see it while they work on the other one. I think we haven't still quite got that right with the iPad. They can do it for simple things, but as the tasks get harder, and what I mean by that is, sort of in the early years of secondary school, I'm now setting quite challenging tasks that are too cognitively large for them to keep in their heads entirely. Whereas 2 or 3 years earlier, the tasks were simple enough they could quite happily work on the iPad between two apps because they could remember everything that was in the other app when they go to the next one. Whereas now the tasks are getting bigger, but they haven't quite mentally developed enough to be able to compartmentalize the problem and think about different mental strategies for working through that.
Yeah, like a multi-step type problem. They don't do as well. So can you share with us some personal habits that help to make you successful?
I think a couple of things. One is I'm really good at email. And what I mean by that is I know where the delete key is and I use it very, very often. I strive to, I don't reply to every email, and I'm sorry about that if anybody listening has ever emailed me and didn't get a reply, but the numbers are such. But I try to keep my inbox clear. This kind of inbox zero idea is very useful to me. I don't always run it at zero, but I run it, 3 or 4 emails sitting there waiting for something to be done on them. I've been doing Getting Things Done. Have you heard of that technology?
Actually, I haven't.
Methodology. It's a book called Getting Things Done, which is actually just out in a new edition this week, or this month rather. But basically it's a kind of time management, personal effectiveness methodology called Getting Things Done. I've been doing that now for about 10 years, maybe more. And, I've gotten better at it over time, but I completely depend on an iOS app and a Mac app called OmniFocus, which is an app that kind of adheres to that methodology of task management and time management. And between my email habits and Getting Things Done and OmniFocus, that's, I think, makes me as productive as I am.
Yeah, well, I have to say I've never had anyone respond back so quickly and just book as that fast. I was like, oh, wow. Yeah,
well, there you go. So that's me getting you out of my inbox as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I'm really glad you didn't push the delete key. Anyway. All right. So what is the one thing that you're doing with your students that you're most excited about right now?
This one's going to sound weird, but bear with me on it, right? I'm really excited about introducing what you might call a sort of systematic self-evaluation into projects. And what I've done in the past is that I've done projects, I've had the students hand it in, and then I've marked it and I've given them the marks back. And that's kind of like the way it always has been and so on. But what I've started doing is I've started using a lot more rubrics in my assessments rather than just simple marking schemes, if you like. And those rubrics contain descriptions of levels of performance. And what I do is I mark against that, But I give that to the students before they start. And then what I do at the end of the project is I give them a blank copy of that rubric and I ask them to mark themselves against these content standards. And what I'm trying to build there all the time is I'm trying to build a self-reflection, self-assessment into their work. And what's absolutely fascinating that comes out of that is the students who mark themselves exactly the same way I mark them, the students who mark themselves much more harshly than I mark them, and the students who mark themselves way more generously than I would mark them. And that tells me something dramatic about their mental process as they do work for school. I had one student last term where we were doing a thing that was out of, I think, 45 marks, and he gave himself fully 10 marks more than I gave him.
That's
and
interesting.
what I realized with that is, all I can see is you're doing this work and you just think that whatever you do is amazing. And he's kind of been the victim of that style of parenting where, he's just been praised for every little thing he's ever done. And he just thinks that if he throws anything down there, he's going to get all the marks in the world for it. This is quite a young class, right? This is 10 and 11-year-olds.
That's interesting.
And just as they come into secondary school, I'm trying to use this technique to help them realize that the world sets certain standards and you will be held to them. Because that eventually comes along. And we've seen in the past students who've been through a very kind of progressive education program with a lot of group work and a lot of collaboration in the classroom, that when they get to the exams where you are absolutely not allowed to do that, they find it just a complete culture shock. There comes a time when you're not allowed to work together. We could argue whether or not that should be a culture shock. I think, in the real world, that requirement is very rarely put on us to not ever work together. So why is it part of the exam system? But part of the exam system it is. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to show these kids that what I want to eventually happen is I want to see that class and all the other classes as well. I want them to mark themselves plus or minus 1 mark as to where I would mark them. And I want them to use that technique to improve their grades before they hand it in. So that they're looking at their own work and they're looking at it against the defined standard and they're saying that's not good enough yet. And they're working really hard to get it up to the standard that is set. Because I think that way it becomes less about you try something and I tell you it's wrong, as opposed to you try something and you evaluate it yourself for what it is, and then you make it better, and then you ask me whether or not it meets the standard. I'm actually really excited about that. I think it's going to be powerful.
I'm really excited about that too, because I think teaching children to do good self-assessments will only help their improvement later. We do that as an adult. You do that your whole life. The people who can really do a good self-assessment on where they need to improve and what they need to be doing, it tend to be more successful in the long run than people who just think they're wonderful. And that's funny because it really is a window into the psychology of that child.
Isn't it? Yeah. And then there's the children who are far too harsh a critic of themselves as well. that tells you its own story as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Before we go on, let us take a minute and hear about our sponsors.
Hey Firestarters, this is Mark, producer of The Luminous Mind. If you're like me, the thought of going out to the store and shopping is enough to make you want to crawl in a hole and hide. If that's you, then do your shopping online through Amazon. Just go to theluminousmind.net, click on the Amazon link, and shop away. Also, most of the books and resources that Rebecca and her guests discuss can be found on our Amazon links as well. Again, if you're like me, you have already accidentally signed up for Amazon Prime. So most of those purchases should have free shipping as well. Good luck! Go on.
Welcome back to The Luminous Mind with Fraser Speirs, educational technology pioneer.
So what advice, tell us first of all what your long-term goals are, and then what advice or encouragement would you have for someone who's just starting out?
So in terms of long-term goals, with the iPad program, I want to do is I want to completely normalize it. I want it to be that we're not the school that everybody comes to see iPads working in the school. I want it to be that you could go to any school in Scotland and you would see the same thing. That's an ambitious goal and I have no power to make it happen. But all I can ever do is I can make the best thing I can make, which is make my school the best I can make it, and then tell people honestly about what we do, how we do it, why we do it, And I think that's, if I have any power in this situation, that's the power I have, is to tell people honestly what works and what doesn't. And I want to see, also for the whole school, I want to see a really great long-term focus in education. I think very often we design a new curriculum and we design it for the way the world is today, or the way the world was when we started writing it, and it took us a number of years to roll it out. So we're now delivering a curriculum that was set for 10 years ago, and we're already revising it. Whereas what I want to do is I use these techniques as well, what we might call futuring or future studies. And this is a defined area of research and work where people look at things like trend analysis and various other kind of techniques like that, and try and predict where the world is going to go in order to make it better. And I want to bring as many of those techniques into education as I can, so that when Georgia, who is 2 right now, if you think of it, Georgia, she's 2, she'll not be leaving school till 2035. And she will be, when the year 2100 comes around, she's only going to be 87 years old. And with the medical advances in her lifetime, there's every reason to expect she will live to see the 22nd century.
Yeah.
That to me says we have to be thinking much longer term about what we do in school, because these kids are not going to only be in school for 10 years. They're going to have to be lifelong learners. So that's where this transferable skills agenda comes in again. This is nothing that other people haven't said before, but I think the thing I love about my school is I get to actually do it. I don't get to just talk about it and see how great it would be if we did. I get to say, well, here's something I've designed that we are going to actually do. And that, I think, is very powerful.
Well, and they say that children that are in school now, basically they will be performing jobs that aren't even created yet, so here you are trying to teach them for jobs that aren't even being created. And so when you're already behind, like you said, 10 years behind with that textbook or, with the information or what you're trying to teach them, you're actually putting them way further behind than that even.
Rebecca, here's the flip side of that statement, and I agree with it completely. But the flip side is that many of the jobs we are training the students for today will no longer be there by the time they get out into the workforce.
Yeah.
That's the flip side of that conversation. And I'll give you just one example that I've been thinking about recently, which is many of the jobs that a junior lawyer would do are things like legal discovery of documents. And all of that is being automated by software right now. So many of those entry-level accountancy jobs and junior lawyer jobs are really dwindling away. I had a conversation with my accountant, and I showed him the accounting package I use, which is an online program called Free Agent. And I showed it to him, and he said, well, what about this? And then I showed it had that, and he said, what about this? And there it was. And by the end of this little demonstration, he just said, thank goodness I'm retired in 5 years. That was all he said, And I could see the junior accountant in the room just looking very kind of nervous around.
What do I do? Yeah.
Because all the tasks that she would have typically done for me in the past, this program had already done.
I guess what I'm taking from this is we've got to put our expectations for education even higher. Like you said, those entry-level jobs are going to be at a much higher skill set than what we're used to in the past.
Yeah, a much higher skill set or a much lower skill set. Because one of the kind of paradoxes of high technology is that it's the middle skill range that gets hollowed out first. There are no robot heart surgeons yet, and there are no robot binmen yet, but there are robot junior lawyers, and there are robot junior pharmacists, and there are software-based junior doctors in some cases. And it's interesting that the lowest skilled jobs and the highest skilled jobs are the most protected ones, and it's this sort of middle range, middle class job that's starting to disappear. A travel agent, a bookseller. Many of these jobs are starting to disappear, and I think that's an interesting challenge for careers education in school.
I think what you're saying, like a mechanic's job, I mean, we're not even training kids for that anymore, even though they still need those. Is that what you're saying? That maybe some of those jobs that we saw were low skill, we're more focused on sending them to college to do higher skill jobs, or the middle of the range jobs, but a lot of those lower skill jobs like a welder or a car mechanic or some of those jobs are not being done anymore, or we're not training for that. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I suppose it's the kind of thing like if you take like a real average student, what would they have done in the past? They would have maybe gone to college for a couple of years and then got a junior job in an office or something and then worked their way up. And I think what we're seeing in some of the youth unemployment stuff right now is not just that nobody wants to hire anybody, but people just don't need like a junior secretary. They've got a paperless office, everything's email. There's not a lot of that kind of paper admin task to do anymore. When I look at what comes into the mailroom at our school, it's all parcels from Amazon, catalogs that we just throw straight in the bin. And the job there actually is to winnow through all the junk mail to find the one thing that still comes through on paper. And a much bigger job is, for example, taking care of our Google Docs installation and making sure everything's tidy in there and so on. That's a much more interesting and bigger challenge.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah. What an interesting thing to think about. So what advice or encouragement, I mean, based on that, would you give somebody...
That's a pretty pessimistic picture.
Starting out.
I think really, if something's going to save us, it's the idea that we can have a flexible mindset towards education. The very famous book by Carol Dweck about mindset and whether you have a fixed or a growth mindset. And I think that's a very, very precious idea, because we talk a lot, the phrase that's used in Scotland is lifelong learning. I mean, it's in the Education Secretary's title, the Cabinet Secretary for Education and Lifelong Learning. We give those titles and we use that terminology, but what does that really mean? Can we provide state-funded structures for people to go back and learn at any stage of their life? We probably can't afford that. But if we can instill it in people themselves, then
that's true.
That's incredibly powerful. That's where that's going to come from. That plus the internet through your life is going to be a very powerful technique for learning and relearning things. And Greenock, the town where I live and work, is a former shipbuilding town. It used to be full of shipyards, and now there's only one left. And 20 years, 30 years after all the major shipyard business left the town, you still meet people who say, "What are you doing?" He says, "Oh, I'm a riveter in the shipyards." You would say, "Well, how long was it since you worked in the shipyards?" "Oh, it's been 25 years, but I'm still a riveter in the shipyards." And that's the kind of anecdote of somebody who doesn't have a growth mindset. They went from school, they went into the yards, they started riveting ships in 1961, and that's how they think of themselves for the rest of their long, long life, is that they rivet ships together in the Clyde, which nobody does anymore. And in some ways, giving people the mindset where they can unlearn something and relearn a whole other field, and also getting the credentialing structures right so that people can move from one qualified field into another qualified field without a major break in their career, is going to be an interesting and very difficult political challenge. If people want to become teachers who have been something else, they have to essentially take a year out of their life to go and get retrained as a teacher, as if they were like a new graduate, and then go into teaching. And we're starting to see so teaching is just one example, but you're starting to see some movement now in other routes into professions because of this requirement for flexibility and relearning and changing careers, midlife. Whereas, in our parents' generation, you trained for something, you did that for your entire life.
Yeah, exactly.
That's never going to be the way of it anymore.
Yeah.
And structures have to adapt, have hope and have expectation that they will adapt, because they have to.
What do they say? Every 5 years, somebody will probably have to change a job because of it will be automated out or something like that. So, well, on the other side, that's scary to that. If we created an educational environment that is boring to children, and that's what they associate with learning, that doesn't help our attitudes about lifelong learning.
No, it does not. If you end up put off learning by your experience in school, wouldn't that be the biggest failure of all? The whole system designed to encourage learning is the thing that puts people off it.
Exactly. So do you have a favorite book or resource that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, I got two I want to mention. My favorite book at the moment is a book called The Children's Machine, and that's by Seymour Papert, who was a famous computer scientist and educationalist who did a lot of work in the late 60s and 70s, and later on as well, about the use of computers in schools. And The Children's Machine is a great book and has so many great insights and quotes and quotable lines in it. I really love that book. The second book I want to mention is a book called Futuring, The Exploration of the Future, by a guy called Edward Cornish. And that's a book that I use to learn about some of the techniques that I mentioned, where you look at things like foresight analysis and trend analysis and things like that to try and figure out where the world is going and try to work out so as not to be surprised by the future. And I really recommend that if you want to get into thinking in that way, that's a great introductory book for a lot of that stuff.
Oh, those are great. Thank you. So speaking of, the future, what changes would you like to see in the future, or what's a legacy that you'd like to leave?
I would like to see, a majority of schools just assume that everybody should have a computer. If I've been able to advocate for anything, I think that would be an incredibly valuable default position to get to for a country or a government, to say every student should have a computer. And it might happen despite governments, that students will just have so many computers that you won't be able to even know if they've got them in school anymore.
Yeah.
That world is coming with your smartwatch, right? That, pretty soon we're going to have full body scanners going into the exam room to make sure nobody's taking in any technology, because you might not be able to visually detect that somebody's got a computer with them anymore. I think what I sincerely hope is that schools will look at that world and realize how quickly it is coming, and we need to get in line really sharp. Otherwise, we're just going to be completely bypassed by all kinds of informal learning. Informal learning will be a kind of anachronism that we have to work through in order to get credentials.
Yeah.
But it won't have a lot of meaning for a lot of students.
Yeah, if students don't like the learning they're getting formally, and they realize that they can teach themselves. If a teacher isn't, if a teacher isn't very flexible, he may work himself right out of a job with his inflexibility.
The stream is going to bypass you. I say YouTube deliberately because if you think about it, YouTube is the absolute hub of all informal learning in internet-connected societies.
Yeah.
You want to learn something, where do you go to learn it? You go to YouTube to watch somebody else do it. I suspect there's not much you cannot learn from YouTube.
Yeah.
The level to which you'll learn it and the rigor with which you'll learn it, that's all up for debate. But if it's something like, I want to cook this steak I've got in the fridge, how am I going to do it? Well, I'm going to go to YouTube. I'm going to watch a 3-minute video that will tell me how to do it, and I'll just do it.
Well, I was teaching my son about different habitats. It's awesome to be able to learn, you learn about desert habitat and be able to Google that on YouTube and see that, and what that entails. It's not just a coloring picture that he does anymore. It's something, that's vivid and live, even though we don't live in the desert. So.
Yeah, I'll give you just one quick
awesome.
example from my classroom. I was teaching about how the internet works and how the internet gets to your house or your school. And a student in the class asked me and said, "Mr. Speirs, what does the other end of that cable look like?" I said, "Well, what do you mean by that?" I said, "Well, you've talked about my computer connected to the internet, but what's on the other end?" I said, "Well, there's data centers on the other end, and that's Netflix and Google and Amazon and so on." And he said, "Well, what does that look like?" And I said, "Well, hang on a minute. We're on to YouTube, and on the Google for Work blog, they have this great sort of 7-minute video where you get a tour of a Google data center, and we just sat and watched that."
That's awesome.
Ben, that's what it looks like. And we could see inside the Google data center, into which I could never, ever get those students to have a tour of a Google data center because they would never allow us in.
Yeah.
But we could go in through YouTube.
Or with time or distance. I mean,
Exactly.
That's awesome. Yeah. Well, and that brings the learning to life, like you were saying, that makes it very relevant and makes it exciting to them.
Absolutely.
So before we say goodbye, I feel so bad. I've taken a whole hour of your time, but before
okay.
I've had a great time talking to you though. So
yeah, me too.
But before we say goodbye, do you have any final parting words of advice or maybe a favorite quote you'd like to share? And then if you'd like to give us your contact information, maybe how we can get a hold of you, that would be great.
Mm-hmm. I think in parting, be optimistic. We've talked about a lot of very pessimistic things tonight, and I apologize for that, but that's what you get when you bring Scottish people onto your podcast. But I think fundamentally, I was asked recently to give a presentation that reviewed the year. It was a review of 2014 to our church group, and I gave an incredibly positive presentation. And some people actually came to me afterwards and they actually sort of upbraided me for giving a positive view of 2014 because it was clearly the worst year ever. But if you look at all the measurements, infant mortality, hunger, pollution, death through warfare, maternal mortality, all these numbers, malnutrition, poverty, everything is getting so much better. And there are speed bumps along the way, there are rocky roads, but I feel, when I look at the grand scheme of things, I feel overwhelmingly positive about what's to come. And I really look forward to seeing what comes next.
That's a great way to end. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us. It's been super fun.
Yeah, it's been great to talk to you, Rebecca. So thanks for having me.
Great.
Thank you for listening to The Luminous Mind. To learn more about Fraser Speirs, go to our show notes at theluminousmind.net. Also, be sure to become a subscriber to our free email list so you can receive notifications for our weekly audio blog, The Spark. We would love to have you join our program. Do so by going to the scheduling tab to become a fire starter today. Help support the podcast by making all your Amazon purchases through the free Amazon widget on our website, theluminousmind.net. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Google+. Get our audio content on YouTube, iTunes, and Stitcher. Leave us a review. Tell us how we can help you so together we can continue to light minds on fire and change the paradigm of education.